This video is about skin. Skin is 16% of your body weight and by far the largest organ. Now, a lot of times we don't think of skin as an organ, but in fact, skin is an organ because it consists of multiple tissues. Remember that cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs. Organs then make up systems. So skin is going to be part of your integumentary system. Skin plus accessory structures. So here are the two major components of the integumentary system. Cutaneous membrane, that's going to consist of epidermis, dermis, and then depending on who you're talking to, the hypodermis. And then there's accessory structures, hair, nails, glands, that will make up the integumentary system. You'll notice the epidermis is the top layer. Epi means above, hypo means below, dermis, the middle layer. So we'll look at these three layers and some of their parts and their functions. So what are some functions to skin? Well, the main functions of skin are things like protection, where it's keeping parasites and other things out of the body. Thermoregulation, which just means temperature regulation. Things like sweating or goosebumps. Vitamin D, which you get from the sun. And then sensing, like when something's crawling on your skin detects that and can send that message to your brain. You can do something about it. So here's a diagram of skin with some of its component parts. So for example, A, you're looking at hair. B, you're looking at a pore for a sweat gland. C, you're looking at this ridge that's separating the epidermis, the top layer, from the dermis, the bottom layer. So K here, that's the epidermis. H is this, again, is kind of pointing to the ridges specifically, the papillary layer. J is the dermis. I is the hypodermis. You'll notice that the dermis has hair follicles, blood vessels, nerve endings. The hypodermis has large blood vessels, but that's where most of the fat is stored. That's adipose tissue. The yellow picture there is adipose tissue. Back over to the other side, D is pointing to a sebaceous gland or oil gland. E is pointing to a nerve ending attached to the hair follicle. F is pointing to a little tiny muscle called an erector pili muscle. It makes your hair stand on end. It's what gives us goosebumps. G is pointing to a sweat gland. So those are some of the main structures that we would find in the integumentary system. These are some of the cells in the epidermis. The keratinocytes, site means cell, keratin is what it does. It produces keratin. Keratin is a protein that creates a waterproofing layer. So as the cells fill with keratin, they become waterproof, but they do die. So the very top layers of your skin are just dead skin cells. The basal cells, number 5, that's the layer where these new keratinocytes are growing. So basal cells, they divide and make new cells. The melanocyte, number 6, is producing melanin. Melanin is the skin pigment. And the Merkel cells, those cells are involved in sensing. So they're more nerve type cells. There are different types of skin on your body. So for example, the palms of your hand and the soles of your feet, they have an extra layer of skin that makes them thick. And that's very helpful because those layers of skin get worn a lot, and the cutaneous membrane is very helpful to resist friction. So thick skin is going to have this thick layer of stratum corneum. It's going to be associated with sweat glands, but they're a special kind of sweat gland. The soles of your feet, the palms of your hand, and they also have this extra layer, stratum lucidium. So lucid just means clear, so it's like a clear layer of cells. Thin skin has a thin stratum corneum, and they also have sweat glands, but slightly different. We'll look at that later. So this is the layers of epidermis. Starting at the bottom, the basal layer, where the basal cells will be stratum basale, the basal layer. Then you have this next layer, the spinosum stratum. Spinosum is the spiny cells. Then you have this kind of grainy layer. That's the green layer. Is stratum granulosum. So think granular, grainy. Stratum lucidium is the clear layer. And then stratum corneum, that's where you would develop things like calluses and corns. The easy way to remember these layers of the epidermis is this little acronym: before signing, get legal counsel. Before signing, get legal counsel. Basal, spinosum, granulosum, lucidium, corneum. So here's the skin layers. You can see the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. But here we're going to focus more on the dermis layer. You'll notice there's two major parts to the dermis layer: the papillary dermis and the reticular dermis, these two layers. So the papillary dermis is more loose areolar tissue. It has a lot of collagen and elastin in it, some nerve endings, touch receptors. The reticular layer has this dense, irregular elastin in it. It's a little bit more vascular, a lot more blood vessels there. So if you look at some of these characteristics, we can put them in the categories epidermis or dermis. So avascular means without blood vessels. That's epidermis. You don't have blood vessels in your epidermis. Nerve endings are mostly dermis. That bumpy layer in the dermis makes up your fingerprints. Melanocytes are in your epidermis. They produce melanin. Keratin is associated with your epidermis. Stratum means layer. So layers are going to have to deal with your epidermis, and papillary is one of the categories of the dermal layers. So papillary is one category, reticular is the other. The papillary is much thinner. Fibrous is going to be more reticular fibers. Loose is going to be more papillary. White blood cells moving through it is reticular. If it tears, that makes a stretch mark. That's in the reticular part of the dermis. And blood vessels are more in the reticular part. Tearing will form like stretch marks, but it also forms scars. Your skin has these contour lines that kind of move around your body, around the contours of your body. And if you get a cut that's parallel to those contour lines, chances are that they'll be able to heal without scarring. But if the cut is perpendicular to those lines, then you're much more likely for a scar to form. When that scar forms, that tissue isn't pigmented, and so we can see it for a long time. The hypodermis layer then is below the dermis. It's filled with adipose tissue and very, very large blood vessels, which is why you hear of things like hypodermic needle. So a hypodermic needle is sticking through the epidermis, through the dermis, into the hypodermis, where it can reach the much larger blood vessels. And this is where we're getting things like cushioning and insulation, the thermoregulation by insulation, and some energy stored in that hypodermis layer. It's the melanocytes that are going to primarily give your skin color. So whether your skin is light or dark, it's not a question of how many melanocytes. We all have about the same amount. It's the amount and the type of melanin that they're producing. So increased ultraviolet radiation causes melanocytes to release melanin, which is what gives the skin a pigment. When we have a concentration of melanin, that's where we get things like moles or freckles even, which is, the freckles are genetic. But there's two types of melanin: eumelanin, which is the black-brown color, and phenomelanin, which is more of a reddish color. And a combination of those pigments give you your skin color. So when you think about like what impacts skin color most, definitely melanocytes. Of course, if you're exposed to lots of UV radiation, then the tanning will increase the production of the melanin. But blood flow can influence skin color, so you might turn red if you're feeling warm, or you might look pale if your face is draining of blood. A diet can certainly impact skin color, like by eating too many carrots, you might look yellow, or if your liver is damaged, you might have jaundice and look kind of yellow or orange for the carrots. There are some conditions where you might have abnormal skin color. For example, albinism is a genetic condition where you don't produce melanin with your melanocytes. Vitiligo is where you have melanocytes in areas that stop production. This is more of an autoimmune disease. Cyanosis is where you have more like blue skin because you're restricting the oxygen supply to that area. Jaundice is a yellow pigmentation. It usually means that your liver is not functioning correctly. Pallor just means your skin's looking pale. a lot because it's drained of blood. Or hematoma, that's a bruise where the capillaries underneath your skin have burst, and that creates some problems. Here are some skin markings that you might see, and you can see them here. The friction ridges, that makes up your fingerprints. The flexion lines, that's like where your skin is bent and creased, like here on your hand, for example. The freckles, which is accumulation of melanin, or moles, which are accumulation of melanin as a result of UV production. Lastly is hemangioma, or a birthmark. That concludes this video.